So back to chapter 5, and we are now talking about measuring ingredients. And this is really important because conversions will be on the midterm exam. So for next week's lab, you're going to have to complete table A3 in chapter or unit 2, and those conversions will be on the midterm. So it's really important that you use the right measuring technique depending on the ingredient. And we'll talk about this for lab next week, but in particular, liquid should be measured in clear graduated measuring cups. Liquid is measured via volume, not weight. So that's going to be different than dry measurement cups. Eggs are range in size from peewee to jumbo large, but large is the standard size for recipes. So if you are reading a recipe and it says 2 eggs, it's referring to large eggs. Fat is measured in liquid measuring cups or graduated measuring cups if it's liquid. If it's solid, you either want to warm it to its plastic state and push it into a fractional cup, or if you're measuring butter, for instance, you actually can see the measurements right on the packaging, which is nice. Sugar depends on the type of sugar. Granulated sugar, you're going to pour into a measuring cup and level off with the scoop and sweep method, which we're going to see videos of next week. Brown sugar, on the other hand, should be packed into the cup and then leveled off. Confectioner sugar, you want to sift and then pour it into the cup and level off. Flour, the best way to actually weigh flour is, the best way to measure flour is by weight. But you can also lightly scoop into the measuring cups and level off with the scoop and sweep method. So weight is the way that a professional baker would measure ingredients. It is the most accurate. But for most everyday bakers, using measuring cups is totally fine. And also, it kind of depends on your scenario. So if you are measuring a really large batch of something for production, like say in food service management, you're going to want to probably use weight because it's going to take forever to measure out like a cup of flour to get to 6 pounds, for instance. But if you're doing a recipe for the everyday home cook, so let's say you're recommending a recipe to a patient or client, you're probably going to want that recipe to be in cups because not everybody has scales at home. So here are some of the measuring equivalents. And you always want to just have some basic ones down. So for instance, 8 ounces is a cup. Or we always say a pint's a pound the world round. So 12. A pint's a pound the world round means that there's 16 ounces in a pint and 16 ounces in a pound, which is also 2 cups. So teaspoons, some of the more important ones, there's 3 teaspoons in 1 tablespoon. There's 2 tablespoons in an ounce. There are 8 ounces in a cup, as we said. 2 cups are in a pint, 2 pints in a quart, and 4 quarts in a gallon. Also 16 tablespoons in a cup. So you guys will get the hang of it as you do your conversion chart next week. So this chart is more of just an FYI. You're not going to be tested on these, but it's really important to know that the flours are not an exact measurement in volume. So cups that we use at home, those are volume measurements. They're not exactly the same in weight. So for instance, in 1 pound of all-purpose flour, there are 4 cups, and per cup, it's 115 grams or 4.2 ounces. So that's going to be different than, let's say, cake flour, which is a lighter flour. That's going to have only about 3.4 ounces per cup. And then you need 4.5 cups for a pound. So now let's talk about mixing techniques. So there are a bunch. Mixing means that you are combining 2 or more ingredients dispersed evenly into one product. So stirring, this is just blending using a circular method. Beating, this is when your ingredients are moved vigorously back and forth, round and round, and up and down until smooth. This is what you do when you are beating, let's say, eggs and sugar for a cake. Blending is when you mix your ingredients so thoroughly that they become one. So if you're combining your dry and your wet, you're going to blend until combined. Binding, this is when the ingredients adhere to each other. So if you are breading a piece of fish, for instance. Creaming, this is when you beat fat and sugar until light and airy. This is the first step in making cookies. Whipping is when you are vigorously mixing to incorporate air into a product. So, for instance, whipped cream, right? Folding is when you gently incorporate one ingredient into another. So if you are making a cake and it has egg whites in it, and those egg whites are whipped, and then you blend them into your dry ingredients, you're going to fold them so that you don't dissipate the air and you get a nice, beautiful volume. And I went the wrong way. So let's talk about mixing methods for baked goods. These are important. So the first is the conventional creaming method. And this is, like I said, how you make cookies. So this is when you cream your fat and sugar together. And what it does is it incorporates air while suspending sugar crystals and air bubbles into the fat. Then when you bake it, as the fat melts, it creates air cells that migrate toward the liquid. And this gives you a very fine grained texture. So it's not going to have big holes in your cookies. You want little teeny tiny holes. That means it's a fine grain. Then you're going to add your eggs. And then you'll add your dry ingredients in small portions, alternating with the wet ingredients if there are wet ingredients. So another food that's made with this method is shortened cakes, like, for instance, pound cake. So here's the most important part of most of these mixing techniques, and these are RD exam questions. If you overstir, or like what can go wrong? That's the questions. So if you overstir, you're going to get a compact texture with little rise and tunnels and a peaked top. If you stir too little, you'll get large pores, a crumbly grain, and excess browning. And both will result in low volume. So that's some of the takeaway you need to take from this mixing methods. So the conventional sponge method is when you have a portion of sugar mixed with your egg or beaten egg or egg white, and then you fold that into the batter at the end. This is called a foam. And so this is when you make a meringue, if you will, where you take egg whites and sugar and you whip them until they create a aerated mixture, which is called a meringue. And then you're going to take your dry ingredients and fold those in, and you'll get a really light cake from that. And so for the conventional sponge method, you might be using egg yolks or whole eggs instead of butter because the yolks have some fat in them, and those are beaten with the sugar. And then you're going to add your dry ingredients in increments to that yolk mixture. And at the very end, you'll fold in that white mixture that we talked about, and that'll give you some increased volume. And this is for unshortened cakes. So these are going to be for sponge cakes or a roulade. And a roulade, if you aren't familiar, is when you cook a cake in like a cookie sheet, and then you put filling in it and you roll it up. So because you have the egg whites, you have a really airy cake, but because of the yolks, the fat, it keeps the cake nice and tender, and you're able to roll it. So chiffon cake is a hybrid of both a shortened and an unshortened cake. And this is where you combine the dry and the wet ingredients. But there's actually oil in this one, so you're combining yolk and oil. Then you whip your egg whites. And then you add your wet ingredients into the dry and whisk until smooth, and then fold in your egg whites. So the major difference here is that you're combining your dry ingredients with some fat like you would in the with a shortened cake. So another mixing method is your single stage method, or the one bowl or dumping method. This is what you're going to use for packaged cake mixes, where your sequence and mixing is important. Your dry ingredients are added to the bowl first, blended together, because you want to evenly distribute your chemical leaveners, which we'll talk about later in the class. And then you're going to add your liquid ingredients to the dry, one at a time, and then you just mix it just until blended. If there's fat in this recipe, which there usually is, it's going to be in a liquid state. So it's either going to be like a neutral oil, like vegetable oil, or butter. There's no creaming involved. And there's also no whipping of like the eggs. Everything just kind of goes into one bowl, is mixed, and goes in the oven. Then your pastry blend method, and this is when your fat is cut into the dry ingredients. We're going to see this towards the end of the class with scones, and this allows for a really flaky texture. And there's usually milk, sugar, baking powder, and salt in this mixture. And the wet ingredients are gradually added to the mixture. Biscuit method is when you're combining all your dry ingredients, and then you're going to cut your fat in and then add liquid last. And the dough is mixed just until the ingredients come together. So there's not a lot of liquid in a biscuit method, just enough to moisten. And you want to make sure with these methods that you don't overmix, because if you overmix, you're going to start developing the gluten or the proteins in the flour, and this is going to create a tougher texture. The muffin method is known as the two-stage mixing method. So this is what you're going to see if you've ever made muffins, banana bread, those kinds of things. We call them quick breads. And that's where you combine your dry and your moist ingredients and mix separately in two separate bowls. So for instance, you'll combine your baking powder, baking soda, and flour and salt in one bowl. And then your other bowl, you'll combine your eggs and your milk and your fat, melted butter or oil. And then you'll combine them just until blended. And again, you don't want to overmix because you'll get a tough baked good. So those are your mixing methods. Definitely make sure you are reading those. And as I said before, keep in mind any of the places where you see on slides, this could be like what happens if such and such. Those are really important to know. So what happens if you overmix? What happens if you undermix? Make sure you make note of those. So seasonings and flavorings, and we're going to go over these really quickly because we already talked about these in lab this week. So seasoning is a compound that enhances the flavor in a food. And a flavoring is a substance that adds a new flavor. So seasoning is like adding salt and pepper, whereas a flavoring would be adding vanilla extract. So there's different kinds of salt. There's sea salt, rock salt, kosher salt, and flavored salt. And salt can be used to cure foods because it draws the moisture out. As we talked about previously, water follows salt, right? It can also be used as a binder to form a gel, such as in sausage production. It can be used as a texture enhancer because it creates elasticity in bread doughs and texture in cheeses and ham. If you've ever had bread without salt in it, it is pretty not great. A, it has no flavor whatsoever, and B, the texture is not nice, not as great. It's like kind of crumbly usually. Processed foods contain 75% of all our salt digested. So types of salts. So there are salt substitutes, and these are most often potassium chloride. And why do we use salt substitutes? Because people who have renal disease or kidney failure and heart and liver problems may not be able to have salt in the diet because those could be detrimental. Other types of salt substitutes can be calcium chloride and magnesium sulfate. Then there are different levels of sodium in food. So you might see a label that says low sodium salt, and this means that it has half the sodium. Or light salt, and this means that it still contains some sodium. And there's different kinds of pepper. There's black, white, green, and pink peppercorns. And we already talked about this, but capsicum is in the family of chili peppers, and this is what makes certain foods feel hot because it's actually a feeling, right? This is what you find in cayenne pepper, chili powder, and paprika. So here's your different salt varieties. But the important thing on this slide is the terms describing sodium content, because this is an RD exam question. And I'm going to pause here and pick up on that with the next PowerPoint.